Martin Scorsese's The Irishman is a film that I was waiting for over 10 years. Ever since Robert De Niro first mentioned the project, which he said was an adaptation of a mob book called I Heard You Paint Houses and which would also star Al Pacino and Joe Pesci. I was hooked and constantly fishing for news. I'm a huge fan of gangster films. I'm a huge fan of Scorsese and all the actors mentioned. And at the time, I felt like the mob genre was dead. They just weren't making films like those anymore. And guys like De Niro and Pacino hadn't made anything on the level of what we expect from them in ages. So in a way, in addition to looking forward to the film simply because I thought it would be a good picture, the project was also symbolic in a way, a swan song for the cast, and quite possibly the last major mainstream gangster film starring these guys. Anyway, The Irishman has now been released, and it was a terrific film. A movie definitely to be held within the same breath as the all-time great gangster pictures, one that was nominated for 10 Oscars and gave the cast a chance to have one last big film before they check out. Now that The Irishman has been released, I don't think there's any harm in not necessarily poking fun at the movie, but dissecting elements of it, looking at different creative decisions and what worked and how things could be different. I have said in the past that yes, I think The Irishman is incredible and it's one of my favourite films, but as with most movies, I didn't think it was perfect. The scene where De Niro curb stomps the grocer, for example, sticks out like a sore thumb because the rest of the film is so great. But I didn't want to spend this video picking apart the flaws of the film. What I wanted to do was to take a look at the bizarre casting in the movie, the really weird decisions that were made to cast certain actors in certain roles. I just want to point out before I get into it that I don't have any problem with the casting choices in The Irishman. I might have had a few raised eyebrows on my first watch of the film because it was not what I'd expected, but I quickly got over that. Creative license is a fundamental luxury for film directors to exercise, which Scorsese does often, but upon first impressions things can be quite bewildering. Take Tommy in Goodfellas, for example. Let's say you've read Wise Guy. You know the history behind the events of the film. Maybe you grew up in the neighborhood, whatever. And you know Tommy was in his early 20s when the Billy Bats incident occurred. And then imagine the shock of seeing Joe Pesci cast in the film, who was about 40 or 50 when they shot Goodfellas. Or when Scorsese cast the legendary insult comic Don Rickles as the stern-looking casino manager in Casino. But it works. It works for what they were going for, and likewise the casting in The Irishman works, but that doesn't mean it still isn't weird. One character that caught my attention early on in the film was Joe Glimko, played by Bo Dietl. Now, when I was doing my research on Glimko for my videos on The Irishman, I learned a lot about this guy. I learned that he was one of the most feared gangsters in Chicago, responsible for numerous deaths, and yet with so many public figures in his pocket, he was essentially untouchable. According to some, this was the most dangerous Chicago mobster in history. He worked closely with the outfit's bosses, and he was known as the tough guy. This guy was the real deal, even the way he looked and dressed. And Frank Sheeran says in the book I Heard You Paint Houses that Glimko sounded like how you imagine Al Capone would have talked like. And yet when you watch the film, he's a joke. Glimko is just some fat dude who runs out of puff when he hardly even had to lift a finger pushing one taxi into a river. The constant spluttering and heavy breathing in his speech tells you that his next heart attack is only hours away. It was like Bo just turned up on set, wanting some watermelons, and they turned the camera on. He doesn't fit the part as the suave and terrifying Glimko at all, and yet it still works for what Scorsese was going for. He clearly isn't supposed to be very intimidating in the movie, instead probably being there, along with a lot of other things, to provide audiences with a few light laughs before the film gets serious. His real purpose is obviously to act as essentially a proof for Jimmy Hoffa that Frank Sheeran was adept and could be used a lot more and a lot better than simply a muscle man. Another weird casting choice is Sebastian Maniscalco as Crazy Joe Gallo. Gallo is extravagant, egotistic, arrogant, and hardly ever cracks a smile throughout the film. And I thought Maniscalco did a really good job selling Gallo as a guy who wants to sell himself as a tough, bad boy type gangster who has no respect for authority or hierarchy. There's quite a cool little shot during the Copacabana Don Rickles performance, where Gallo is feigning to pick up a bottle and throw it at Rickles. Rickles literally acknowledges Gallo is a gangster in front of everyone, salutes him. Gallo does it back. He's drawing so much attention to himself. Everybody's bawling with laughter, and then we get a quick little shot of Russell Bufalino's table, where even Frank Sheeran is grinning like an idiot, but Bufalino, he's sitting silently in the corner, not drawing attention to himself. It's like the film is saying, this is the wannabe celebrity gangster, and this is the real gangster. But why it's a strange casting is because by trade Gallo is a comedian, and a pretty well-known one at that. I'm not familiar with his works, but I know if a comedian I knew was in a film in a proper serious role, I might have trouble not expecting him to crack a joke 30 seconds in. It's just like with the casting of Don Rickles, and I was lucky that I didn't know who Rickles was when I first saw Casino. I don't think I'd be able to detach numerous images of him roasting Scorsese and De Niro from my head when watching his ultra-serious performance. That's something that just comes down to personal preference really, and your own experience with a certain actor. Like Action Bronson, who shows up in the end of The Irishman in a very serious scene. I know a lot of people were thrown by his sudden appearance, but for the rest of us who don't know who he was just one of many background characters in the film. Angelo Bruno is a mafia boss who had a few brief appearances in The Irishman. He was the boss of Philadelphia for around 20 years, and he was known as the Gentle Don, often choosing negotiation and bribery where others used violence and intimidation. I'm not saying he was a big old cuddly teddy bear, but from what we know historically, he took care of a lot of people, including non-mafia affiliated citizens, and his reign at the top of his family was one of peace and success. Before he became boss, and after his brutal death in 1980, the Philly family was rampant with killing, infighting and bloodshed. Even when you look at him, he looks like a warm and fuzzy grandpa. But when you watch the film, Bruno is played by Harvey Keitel. Now I don't know about you, but when I see Keitel, the first words that come to mind are not gentle and warm. This dude is terrifying. He's so intense and scary looking. If he was walking in my direction down the street, I'd apologize and cross the road. In the film he has one key scene, and he takes complete control of it, almost making De Niro's character, a hitman who fought in World War II, piss himself. And yet, he's playing a man called the Gentle Don. Again though, with all of these examples, it still works for what Scorsese was going for, because Bruno was intimidating in the book also, and he's supposed to be intimidating in the film, in spite of his reputation in real life. Dominic Lombardozzi as Fat Tony Salerno is a proper weird casting. By this point, it's almost like Scorsese is taking the piss and intentionally casting actors who resemble nothing like the characters they are playing. Casting the 70-plus-year-old trio of De Niro, Pacino and Pesci as people who are 30, 40 and 50 years old is one thing. That's a separate issue. Understandable in a way, because of course, one of the whole points of The Irishman is to get all these three actors in the same film. But what reason is there for casting this relatively young-looking dude as Fat Tony? Surely there is a wrinkly 60-year-old man out there who could have done justice to the part, instead of having Lombardozzi sit through hours of makeup. It's not as if Fat Tony appears young in some flashback scenes like the big three actors. If that was the case, the casting makes sense. And plus, it does look a bit obvious that this is a young man in old man makeup. I'm not sure whether I would have noticed it if I didn't already know beforehand. Lombardozzi, of course, is quite a well-known TV actor. He was in The Wire and played Al Capone's brother Ralph in Boardwalk Empire, which interestingly means Stephen Graham was his boss in Boardwalk, and he was Stephen Graham's boss in The Irishman. But anyway, I do wonder whether it's me saying, with the knowledge that this is a young man in an old makeup, that hey, this looks like a young man in old makeup. If I didn't know, maybe I wouldn't have looked twice. But still, it's quite strange to cast such a young man as such an old one. One of the oddest casting choices in The Irishman, if you didn't know already that he's worked with Scorsese in the past in Gangs of New York, and in fact played Al Capone in the Scorsese-produced Boardwalk Empire, is Stephen Graham as Anthony Provenzano. If you watched the film going in blind, or having seen him in Boardwalk, there probably wasn't any issue. In fact, as I thought was going to be the case based on his capabilities as an actor and his involvement in the movie's story based on the book and the script I read, he's arguably the standout actor, aside from the big three in the film. Stephen Graham does really well in the film, and it's quite a formidable performance, and you can really get a sense of Provenzano's personality come across. The reason why I say it's a weird casting is because you've got all these Italian American actors, some who even knew characters in the film, like with Joe Pesci saying he knew Tony Pro, and Bo Dietl saying he knew the likes of Fat Tony Salerno. There's a lot of casting, especially background actors, that feels very authentic. Italian Americans playing Italian Americans, that kind of thing. And then you've got the role of Italian American mobster Tony Pro, arguably the fourth main character in the film, and definitely one of the most important characters in the movie. And he's played by a British bloke. And not just a Brit, but a Scouser. And for those who don't know, a Scouser is someone who comes from the city of Liverpool. Scousers are known for their very strong, distinctive accent. Speaking as a Brit, I find it so hard to understand what a Scouser is saying, and when you take all of that into account, Graham looks so out of place in and amongst the likes of Pacino and Pesci. But you have to give him credit, he really did pull it off. He was one of the standout performers in the film. But it's quite funny, if you hear him speak, you'll be shocked at how different he sounds in real life. On a side note, I do think Stephen Graham did a great job as Pro. Don't get me wrong, I don't think there's flaws in his performances, but in a perfect world, he wouldn't be the guy I would have picked to play Provenzano in The Irishman. The man who I thought was perfect for the role, who unfortunately died before filming began, and we don't know whether he was ever considered to star in The Irishman, although I like to think he would have been in the film had he not passed away, and that man is Frank Vincent, the late actor known for his roles in Scorsese's Raging Bull, Goodfellas, Casino, and he's also very well known for his part as mob boss Phil Leotardo in The Sopranos. I think Vincent is an on-the-nose perfect casting as Anthony Provenzano. First of all, he's been in the same Scorsese films that Joe Pesci has been in. So if Pesci is a Scorsese regular, then so is Vincent. And in fact, Pesci and Vincent actually had a comedy and singing gig as a duo before they were discovered by De Niro and Scorsese. The point being, Vincent is part of the Scorsese mafia movie family. If The Irishman is a big reunion of mob movie actors, with guys like Harvey Keitel and Al Pacino in on the action, then Billy Batts definitely should have been in it. Pro is obviously also a very big role in the film, sharing many scenes with the main cast. He would have been the centre of attention more so than any previous Scorsese film. Provenzano was also supposed to be around the same age as Jimmy Hoffa as well, which would have made Vincent more age appropriate for the scenes he's in with Al Pacino, as in the film there is quite a noticeable difference between Al Pacino and Stephen Graham in age, especially in the "You're late" scene. It just feels so much more right and authentic to have Vincent in there, in and amongst guys like Pacino and Pesci. It would have been an opportunity for him to get his last hurrah role, just like the rest of the guys did. He even looks like the real-life Anthony Provenzano, and he's brilliant at playing assholes that you just love to hate. It would have been a really great role for Frank Vincent to go out with, and it's a shame that it never materialized with his death. I'm sure if he was alive and healthy, Scorsese would have found a role for him in the film, and I can't see a more perfect part for the man to play than Anthony Provenzano. So going back to the weird casting choices in The Irishman, which casting decisions are weirder than the three main actors? I mean, they're all over the age of 70, and they needed to spend millions on bonkers de-aging effects to make the actors look younger. Talk about miscasting. And Al Pacino, who often looks like an undead zombie in some of his recent flicks, is playing the boisterous Jimmy Hoffa, a man with a magnetic, energetic force about him. He has to give speeches where he pumps up the crowd. He has to fly up and down the stairs in one scene, get up off the sofa like a young man in another. And just the very idea of Al Pacino playing Jimmy Hoffa, it's just so weird. It doesn't fit. He doesn't look anything like the man. He doesn't sound anything like him. He just isn't the person that comes to mind when you think, who can play Jimmy Hoffa? Even if he was capable of playing the man in his prime, which I don't think anyone would doubt, Pacino when filming The Irishman was almost 80 years old, and at no time did Hoffa ever even reach the age of 80 in real life. It's just such a left field casting, and you do think that they just made so many adjustments just to have Al Pacino play the role, the CGI being the main one. And it seems that Scorsese was just desperate to work with Pacino, that he would have made all these adjustments, even though Pacino is just so wrong for the role. You'd think that having Pacino play Russell Buffalino might have been a more appropriate casting. but Scorsese always wanted Joe Pesci for the part. And that's a hugely bizarre casting as well. Bufalino is quiet, reserved, mild-mannered, and likes to remain behind the scenes. When you practically force Joe Pesci out of retirement, this man who is famous for playing raving lunatics, swearing at the top of his voice and just being an all-round volatile psycho, and then you have him playing this old man whose nickname was literally the Quiet Don, it's like Scorsese was intentionally trolling his fans. And then there's De Niro, who, to be honest, I think is actually a good choice to play Frank Sheeran. He's played Americans with Irish ancestry before. He actually looks like the real Sheeran a bit. He seems to have a similar jaw structure. The only real problem is that De Niro is so old, and yet he plays the guy as young as in his 20s and 30s. If De Niro was playing this character in the 80s, no one would bat an eye. In fact, in terms of playing a gangster who's constantly aged up and down, he actually did play a role like that in the 80s in Once Upon a Time in America. And in terms of where we are, audiences are a lot more open and forgiving to young people in old man makeup rather than old people playing young men. With all that being said, I think it's a huge achievement on part of the actors that they actually pulled off their roles in the film. And they weren't just decent or satisfactory, but each gave their best performance in years. The entire draw of The Irishman, the best thing about the film, is the acting from the three leads. It's a wonderful send-off to the three men's careers for them to slip back into familiar territory in this mob picture, but also give us something new to be remembered by. We won't ever have to contemplate with each other, asking how awesome would it have been if Robert De Niro, Al Pacino and Joe Pesci ever made a gangster film together, because after so many years in development, so many issues and delays, they finally did, and it lived up to the immense hype. Thanks for watching.